The story most people remember begins with glamour. Sharp suits, expensive cars, laughter spilling out of dimly lit restaurants, loyalty sealed with handshakes and blood. It is the version immortalized by Goodfellas, a world where crime feels effortless, where power is intoxicating, and where betrayal appears almost inevitable, but somehow understandable. But the truth was far darker. Behind the charisma of Henry Hill was not just a man navigating organized crime, but a man unraveling under the weight of his own decisions. The film told a story of survival. The real history tells a story of erosion, of fear, and of a betrayal that was far more complicated than it ever appeared on screen. Henry Hill did not begin as a legend. He began as a boy watching. Growing up in Brooklyn in the 1950s, Hill was surrounded by something that felt larger than life. Across the street stood a cab stand, a front for men who never seemed to work, yet always had money. They dressed better. They moved differently. People treated them with quiet respect or quiet fear. For a young boy, it was magnetic. According to multiple documented accounts, Hill became fascinated with the rhythms of the neighborhood, the small rituals, the coded conversations, the way doors opened without questions. It was a system built on silence and on power, and he wanted in. By the age of 11, Hill had already made his decision. School became irrelevant. Structure became optional. What mattered was proximity. He began running errands for local mob figures tied to the powerful Lucchese crime family, one of New York's 5 families. At first, the tasks were small: delivering packages, watching cars, carrying messages. But in that world, small tasks were tests, and Henry Hill passed them. He learned quickly, not just what to do, but what not to say. Silence became instinct. Loyalty became currency. And most importantly, he understood something that many outsiders never grasped. Crime was not chaos. It was structure. By his teenage years, Hill was no longer just a runner. He was part of a functioning ecosystem, one that stretched from street-level hustles to high-level operations involving hijacking, loan sharking, and protection rackets. The film portrays this ascent as exhilarating. And for a time it was. There were no consequences, at least none that reached him. Money flowed, authority grew, and the rules seemed simple: obey, earn, and never betray. But even in those early years, cracks were forming. Investigators later discovered that Hill's environment was not just one of opportunity, but one of constant violence. Beatings were routine. Disappearances were unspoken. Mistakes were not corrected. They were erased. And Henry Hill watched all of it. He saw what happened to men who talked too much. He saw what happened to men who stepped out of line. And he learned something else, something the film barely touches. Fear was the foundation of everything. By the early 1960s, Hill had become closely associated with figures who would define his life. Among them was Jimmy Burke, a calculated and ruthless operator, and Tommy DeSimone, whose volatility made him both useful and dangerous. Together, they formed a crew that thrived on risk. Hijacking trucks became their specialty. It was efficient, profitable, and relatively low risk compared to other operations. Goods could be sold quickly, cash flowed fast, and law enforcement often lagged behind. Hill was no longer observing. He was participating. According to multiple accounts, his involvement deepened rapidly. He wasn't just present, he was essential. He helped plan, he helped execute, he helped distribute. And with each success, the illusion strengthened. The idea that they were untouchable. But the reality was shifting. Law enforcement had begun paying closer attention to organized cargo theft rings operating out of New York. Patterns were emerging. Names were being recorded. Faces were being remembered. Hill didn't know it yet, but his world was already under surveillance. Still, the momentum continued. The late 1960s and early 1970s marked a period of expansion. The crew diversified. Drugs entered the picture, despite the mafia's official stance against narcotics. The profits were too large to ignore. And this is where the story begins to diverge sharply from the version most people know. The film presents Hill's involvement in drugs as reckless, but secondary. In reality, it became central. Investigators later discovered that Hill's narcotics operations were extensive and increasingly independent. He was not just following orders, he was building his own network. This autonomy created tension within the organization. because independence in that world was dangerous. It blurred lines, it raised questions, and it attracted attention. By the mid-1970s, Hill was balancing multiple roles: mob associate, drug trafficker, and increasingly liability. The structure that once protected him was beginning to see him differently, not as an asset, but as a risk. And yet, outwardly, everything still looked intact. Money continued to flow. Operations continued to expand. The crew maintained its reputation. To outsiders, nothing had changed. But internally, pressure was building. Because beneath the surface, something far more volatile was taking shape. A single operation. One that would become one of the most infamous crimes in American history. One that would elevate the crew to unprecedented wealth. And one that would quietly set the stage for everything that followed. The Lufthansa heist. At the time, it was almost unimaginable. Millions of dollars in cash and valuables, sitting in a cargo terminal at JFK Airport. Minimal security, predictable routines, vulnerable systems. To men like Jimmy Burke, it wasn't just an opportunity. It was inevitability. Planning began in silence. Information was gathered carefully. Inside contacts were cultivated. Schedules were mapped down to the minute. Every variable was considered. And Henry Hill was there, close enough to see the machinery forming, but not fully aware of how far it would go. Because what the film never fully showed was that this operation was not just about money. It was about control, about proving dominance, and about eliminating anyone who could threaten it. As the plan developed, so did the paranoia. Because the larger the crime, the greater the risk. And in that world, risk was not managed. It was eliminated. Hill began to notice subtle changes. Conversations that stopped when he entered a room. Decisions made without him. A shift in tone, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. He was still inside, but no longer the center. And then came a night when everything moved from theory to execution. The trucks were ready. The timing was set. The men were in place. And as the operation began to unfold, Henry Hill stood on the edge of something he didn't fully understand. A crime that would make them rich and quietly sign their fate. A crime that would make them rich and quietly sign their fate. In the early hours of December 11th, 1978, the plan moved into motion. John F. Kennedy International Airport was quiet. Cargo moved as it always had. Routine, predictable, vulnerable. Inside the Lufthansa terminal, millions of dollars sat waiting. Cash shipment from overseas, unsecured in ways that, to outsiders, seemed impossible. But to the men orchestrating the operation, it was an opening. According to multiple documented accounts, the heist itself was executed with precision that bordered on military discipline. The crew moved quickly, efficiently. No unnecessary noise, no hesitation. They knew the layout. They knew the timing. And most importantly, they had inside help. A Lufthansa employee, compromised long before that night, had provided critical information, security gaps, shift changes, access points, everything the crew needed to turn a high-risk robbery into something almost surgical. The men entered the terminal with authority. There was no chaos, only control. Employees were rounded up, restrained, threatened, but not immediately harmed. The instructions were clear: cooperate and survive. Within minutes, the vault was opened. Stacks of cash, bundled, labeled, untouched, were loaded into waiting vehicles. Estimates would later place the total at nearly $6 million in cash, along with additional valuables. At the time, it was the largest cash robbery in American history. And then, just as quickly as it began, it was over. The trucks disappeared into the night. No alarms, no resistance, no witnesses willing to talk. For a brief moment, it was perfect, but perfection in that world was an illusion. Because the real danger did not begin during the heist. It began after. The film presents the aftermath as celebratory. A victory, a moment of triumph for men who had beaten the system. But investigators later discovered something very different. Panic, not immediately, but steadily, creeping in as the scale of the crime became undeniable. The money was too much, the attention too intense, and the number of people involved too large. Jimmy Burke understood something that many of the others did not. Success had created exposure, and exposure required correction. At first, the instructions were simple. Lay low, spend nothing, disappear. But discipline is fragile, especially among men who have just stolen millions. Within days, cracks began to show. One participant purchased a brand new car. Another was seen wearing expensive clothing. A third began talking, subtly, but enough to be noticed. To outsiders, these actions seemed insignificant, but inside the organization, they were violations. And violations carried consequences. What followed was not immediate, but it was systematic. According to law enforcement records, individuals connected to the heist began disappearing. One by one, a body found in a van, another discovered weeks later. Some were never found at all. The pattern was unmistakable. Anyone who could draw attention, anyone who could talk, anyone who could not be controlled was removed. The film never showed the full extent of this purge. But the truth was far darker. This was not just cleanup. It was elimination. And Henry Hill was watching it happen. He was not part of the inner circle managing the aftermath, not involved in the decision-making, but close enough to understand what it meant. People he knew, men he had worked with, were vanishing, and no one was asking questions. Because in that world, questions were dangerous. Hill began to recognize something unsettling. The rules were changing, or perhaps they had always been this way, and he was only now seeing them clearly. The loyalty he had believed in, the structure he had trusted, was revealing its true nature. Conditional, fragile, disposable. At the same time, law enforcement pressure intensified. The scale of the Lufthansa heist made it impossible to ignore. Federal agencies mobilized. Surveillance increased. Informants were cultivated. Every known associate was examined. And Henry Hill's name surfaced, not as a central figure in the heist, but as someone connected to the crew responsible. Investigators later discovered that Hill was already under scrutiny for unrelated narcotics activity. His drug operations, once a side venture, had grown into a significant liability. He was exposed on multiple fronts, to the authorities, and to his own organization. Because while the government saw him as a suspect, the mob began to see him as a problem. Drug trafficking had always been a sensitive issue within the mafia, officially forbidden, unofficially tolerated, until it became inconvenient. And now, with the Lufthansa fallout still unfolding, inconvenience had become danger. Hill's independence, his growing visibility, his connections outside traditional structures, all of it made him unpredictable. And unpredictability, in that world, was unacceptable. According to multiple accounts, Hill began to sense the shift more clearly. The distance, the silence, the absence of protection. Conversations became shorter. Invitations stopped. The sense of belonging, the illusion of family, began to dissolve. He was still alive, but no longer secure. At the same time, his personal life was collapsing under the same pressures. Drug use intensified. Paranoia increased. Decisions became erratic. The discipline that once defined him was gone, and in its place, instability. The film portrays this period as chaotic, but almost surreal. In reality, it was calculated, because while Hill spiraled, others were making decisions. Jimmy Burke, in particular, had begun to reevaluate his position. The heist had brought wealth, but it had also brought risk, and risk required reduction. Hill's name was now appearing in investigations. His drug activity had drawn attention. His behavior had become unpredictable, all the elements of a liability. And in that world, liabilities were not managed. They were removed. There were no formal discussions, no warnings, no negotiations, only quiet consideration followed by action. Hill did not hear a direct threat. He didn't need to, because by then, he understood the pattern. He had seen what happened to others. Men who made mistakes, men who talked, men who became inconvenient. They disappeared, and now, for the first time, he began to see himself in that pattern, not as an observer, but as a potential target. The realization did not come all at once. It built slowly, through small moments. A look that lingered too long, a conversation that ended too quickly, a meeting he was no longer invited to attend. Each detail insignificant on its own, but together undeniable. According to multiple documented accounts, the final shift came when Hill was drawn deeper into a narcotics operation that went wrong. Arrests were made, names were recorded, And suddenly, the pressure was no longer distant. It was immediate. Law enforcement closed in, and at the same time, the organization stepped back. No assistance, no protection, no reassurance, only silence. Hill found himself in a position he had never experienced before. Alone. For years, he had operated under the assumption that the system would protect him, that loyalty ensured safety. But now, both sides were closing in. The authorities wanted information. The mob wanted distance. And in between, there was nowhere to stand. The film presents his eventual cooperation as a desperate but logical choice. But investigators later suggested something more complex. It was not just fear of prison. It was fear of something far more immediate. Because by the time Hill fully understood his situation, the decision may have already been made for him. Not by law enforcement, but by the men he once called partners. A quiet decision, unspoken, final, and somewhere in that narrowing space between arrest and execution, Henry Hill realized a truth the film never fully captured. He was no longer part of the system. He was its next casualty. He was no longer part of the system. He was its next casualty. The realization did not arrive as a single moment of clarity. It came in fragments, late-night thoughts, unfinished conversations, the growing certainty that every path forward ended the same way: prison or death. According to multiple documented accounts, Henry Hill's arrest in 1980 was not unexpected. It was the culmination of years of exposure, drug trafficking, surveillance, and connections that had finally converged into something prosecutors could act on. But what mattered was not the arrest itself. It was what followed. Inside the system he had trusted for most of his life, an arrest was supposed to trigger a response. Lawyers would appear. Messages would be passed. Reassurances would be given. None of that happened. There were no visitors, no instructions, no protection, only silence. Investigators later noted that this absence was not accidental. It was strategic. By distancing themselves, Hill's associates minimized their own exposure. But to Hill, the message was unmistakable. He had been abandoned. The film suggests that this moment pushed him toward cooperation. But the truth was far more severe. Because at the same time that law enforcement began building their case against him, another calculation was unfolding elsewhere. One that did not involve courts, or sentences, or second chances. Henry Hill knew the pattern. He had watched it unfold after the Lufthansa heist. Men who had once stood beside him gone, not arrested, not imprisoned, erased. And now, his name existed in the same context. Too visible, too unstable, too dangerous to keep alive. According to multiple accounts, Hill began to understand that his greatest threat was no longer the government. It was the organization he had spent his life serving. The same system that had elevated him could now justify eliminating him. And in that realization, the mythology collapsed. The idea of loyalty, the idea of brotherhood, the idea that silence guaranteed protection, none of it held. Because in practice, loyalty flowed in only one direction, upward. And when someone became a liability, loyalty disappeared. Hill's decision to cooperate was not immediate. It was negotiated, measured, calculated under extreme pressure. Federal prosecutors offered something unprecedented: protection, relocation, a new identity, the chance to survive. But survival came at cost, because cooperation meant violating the single rule that defined everything: omerta, the code of silence. Breaking it did not just make someone an informant. It made them a target forever. And yet, Hill accepted. According to court records, Henry Hill entered into an agreement with federal authorities that would reshape one of the most powerful criminal networks in New York. His testimony was not vague. It was detailed, specific, damaging. He provided names, operations, structures, information that investigators had spent years trying to piece together. And now, it was being handed to them. Directly. The film portrays this transformation as dramatic, but almost transactional. In reality, it was methodical. Hill was debriefed extensively, every detail scrutinized, every claim cross-checked. His knowledge became a roadmap for prosecutors building cases against multiple figures connected to the Lucchese crime family. Among the most significant outcomes was the case against Jimmy Burke. For years, Burke had operated with calculated precision, avoiding direct involvement, delegating risk, maintaining distance from anything that could be traced back to him. But Hill changed that. Through testimony and corroborating evidence, prosecutors were able to connect Burke to crimes that had previously remained beyond reach, including murder. It was not immediate, but it was inevitable. Burke was eventually arrested, tried, and convicted, not for the Lufthansa heist itself, but for related violent crimes that Hill's cooperation helped expose. The system had turned inward, and for the first time, it was being dismantled from within. But the consequences did not end there. Tommy DeSimone, the volatile enforcer depicted so vividly in Goodfellas, had already disappeared years earlier. The film presents his death as a direct retaliation. Investigators later suggested a more complex reality. His disappearance was tied to multiple factors: internal tensions, unauthorized killings, and violations that had made him too dangerous even for his own organization. The pattern repeated. Those who created instability were removed. Hill's testimony did not just confirm this. It exposed it publicly. For law enforcement, it was a breakthrough. For the mafia, it was a fracture, because cooperation at that level did more than secure convictions. It undermined the illusion of control, the idea that the system was impenetrable. That silence was absolute. Hill had proven otherwise, and that proof had consequences far beyond his own case. According to multiple documented accounts, his cooperation contributed to a broader shift in how organized crime was investigated and prosecuted. Informants became more valuable. Internal structures became more vulnerable. The strategy changed, and so did the balance of power. But for Henry Hill, survival came with its own cost. He entered the Federal Witness Protection Program, a system designed to erase identity and rebuild lives under strict conditions. New names, new locations, new beginnings. On paper, it offered safety. In reality, it offered isolation. Hill was removed from everything he had ever known. Not just the criminal world, but his past entirely. Friends, routines, familiarity, gone. And in their place, anonymity. The film suggests that Hill struggled to adapt. That much is accurate. But the truth was more complicated. Because while he had escaped immediate danger, he had not escaped himself. According to later interviews and documented behavior, Hill found it difficult to maintain the structure required by witness protection. Substance abuse continued. Stability remained elusive. The discipline that once allowed him to function within organized crime did not translate to a conventional life. And eventually, even that system began to erode. He was removed from the program, exposed again, though no longer as valuable a target as he once had been, because time had changed the equation. The organization he betrayed had weakened. The men who might have sought retribution were imprisoned or gone, and the world he once feared no longer operated in the same way. Henry Hill lived the remainder of his life in a strange space between notoriety and obscurity. He became a public figure of sorts, interviewed, referenced, portrayed. His story was retold, reinterpreted, dramatized, but always incomplete, because what the film never showed, what the narrative often softened, was the cost, not just of betrayal, but of participation. Hill did not simply escape a criminal life. He carried it, in memory, in consequence, in the knowledge of how it truly worked. He died in 2012, not violently, not dramatically, but quietly, far removed from the world that had once defined him. And in that ending, there is something telling. Because the story most people remember is one of excitement, of rise and fall, of crime and consequence wrapped in cinematic energy. But the real story is slower, colder, more deliberate. It is a story of systems that consume their own, of loyalty that exists only until it becomes inconvenient, and of a man who believed he understood the rules until he became subject to them. Henry Hill did not just betray the mafia. According to multiple documented accounts, he exposed it, and in doing so, revealed a truth far more unsettling than anything shown on screen. There was never any loyalty to begin with.